when Lake Peigneur vanished in minutes. I lived through something that still makes scientists scratch their heads in disbelief. November 20th, 1980. The day an entire lake disappeared from the face of the earth in minutes, swallowing everything into depths that shouldn't have existed, revealing secrets buried so deep that maybe they were meant to stay hidden forever. What rose from those depths still haunts everyone who witnessed it, including me. I was working near Lake Peigneur that morning, just another quiet day in southern Louisiana. This wasn't some mysterious body of water. It was as ordinary as lakes come. Shallow, peaceful, barely 10 feet deep at its deepest point. Fishermen would come here for bass and perch. Families would spend lazy afternoons by its shores. The water was so clear you could see straight to the bottom, and kids would wade in without a care in the world. I'd grown up around this lake, spent countless hours fishing these waters with my grandfather. He used to tell me stories about the old days, when Jefferson Island was just another piece of Louisiana swampland. But by 1980, everything had changed. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company had been mining beneath our feet for over 60 years, carving out massive underground chambers from pure white salt deposits that had formed millions of years ago. Most folks didn't think much about what was happening below the surface. Why would they? The lake looked the same as it always had. But I knew better. I'd worked with some of the miners, heard their stories about the vast cathedral-like chambers they'd carved out down there. Rooms nearly 100 feet wide, 80 feet tall, supported by pillars of salt that held up the entire structure. Some tunnels went down 1,500 feet, deeper than most skyscrapers are tall. The mine ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Hundreds of men would descend into that underground labyrinth every shift, trusting those salt pillars to keep millions of tons of earth from crushing them. And for decades, that trust had never been broken. The mine had an impeccable safety record, emergency drills every 6 months like clockwork. But all that experience, all those precautions, couldn't prepare us for what was coming. Then Texaco showed up. One of the world's largest oil companies had secured drilling rights on Lake Peigneur, convinced there was black gold hidden around those same salt formations that had made Diamond Crystal rich. It made sense. Geological shifts that create salt domes often trap petroleum deposits. They brought in Wilson Brothers as contractors, set up a floating drilling rig right there on the lake. Nobody saw any danger in it. Texaco had their surveys. Diamond Crystal had their mine maps. 2 different operations, working the same area, but supposedly far enough apart to avoid any problems. The engineers ran their calculations, double-checked their coordinates, and convinced everyone that there was no risk of interference. How wrong they were. What I want you to remember about this story is how quickly everything can change. Leave a comment with the word "vanished" if you're following along, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next defies every law of nature you think you know. That morning started like any other. The sun hadn't even risen yet when I heard the first strange sounds drifting across the water. I was about a quarter mile from the Texaco platform, close enough to see the crew working their drilling operation. At 4:30 a.m., their 14-inch drill bit had jammed at 1,228 feet down. Nothing unusual about that. Drilling through compacted sediment and rock formations, you expect some snags. The crew tried everything, moving the pipe, rotating it, applying more pressure. Standard troubleshooting that I'd seen dozens of times before. But by 5:45, when the next shift arrived, something was different. I could hear it in their voices, see it in the way they moved around the platform. There were these faint popping sounds coming from deep underground, like someone snapping branches in a distant forest. At 6:30, the platform tilted. Just slightly at first, barely noticeable unless you were really watching. But I was watching, and I could see the rig wasn't level anymore. Some of the workers started talking among themselves, wondering if the lake bed was unstable. Smart men, those Texaco crews, they decided to abandon the platform and head for shore, just to be safe. Then at 7:25 a.m., everything went to hell. The rig suddenly lurched hard to one side. Metal screamed, cables snapped like rubber bands, and the entire structure began collapsing. The crew could only watch in horror as their drilling rig, a massive piece of industrial equipment taller than a 3-story building, sank into water that was supposed to be only 10 feet deep. It didn't just tip over or partially submerge. It vanished completely, swallowed by depths that shouldn't have existed. That's when the lake itself began to move. The water directly above where the drilling rig had disappeared started swirling, forming a dark whirlpool that grew stronger by the second. It was like watching the surface of the earth collapse inward, as if some cosmic drain plug had been pulled from the bottom of reality itself. The current accelerated, growing more violent, and I realized I was witnessing something that defied every natural law I thought I understood. The Texaco crew, now safely on shore, could only stare in stunned silence. The suction force was unlike anything any of us had ever seen. 11 supply barges that had been moored nearby were pulled in one by one, dragged helplessly into that growing vortex like toys in a bathtub. But the most terrifying part was what we couldn't see. 55 men were still trapped underground in the salt mine, and millions of gallons of lake water were flooding toward them. The destruction above ground was just the beginning. Below the surface, something far more catastrophic was unfolding. I need to pause here and tell you something that still gives me nightmares. We're at the halfway point of this story, and I promise you, the most unbelievable part is still coming. If you think you've heard strange things before, subscribe now, because what happened next changed the very laws of physics in that place. Deep beneath Lake Peigneur, in the Jefferson Island salt mine, 55 men were fighting for their lives. Junius Gaddison, the mine's master electrician, was working on the 1,300-foot level when he first heard those hollow banging sounds echoing through the tunnels. He'd spent years in that mine, knew every sound of normal operation, and this wasn't normal. Then he saw the thin stream of murky water creeping along the mine floor. Fuel drums that should have been stacked neatly near the storage area were floating, moving along that shallow stream. In that instant, Junius realized what was happening. Lake water was pouring into the mine, and they had minutes, maybe less, before everything collapsed. Without hesitation, he hit the power switch and flashed the evacuation signal. The message went out through every level of the mine: drop everything and get out now. He grabbed the nearest phone and shouted to the hoist operator to lower the mine's only elevator. Time was running out, and everyone knew it. Down on the 1,500-foot level, nearly a quarter-mile below the surface, Foreman Earl Dundas and dozens of workers heard the alarm. They were deep in those massive cathedral-like chambers, surrounded by walls of pure salt that had taken decades to carve out. But Earl understood something terrifying. Salt mines are incredibly fragile once water gets in. Unlike coal or stone mines that might withstand flooding, salt dissolves. Those pillars holding up millions of tons of earth above them were already starting to crumble. The water arrived as a trickle, then became a torrent. Dark, rapidly rising water that carried with it the smell of the lake and the promise of death. In the tunnels, conveyor belts stopped moving. Equipment fell silent, and the only sound was the deafening roar of rushing water and men shouting to each other in the darkness. By the time the first group reached the elevator on the 1,300-foot level, they were waist-deep in water. Junius and his crew crammed into that metal cage, dripping wet and shaking as it lurched upward toward the surface. But there were still dozens of men below, and the lower levels were already beginning to vanish beneath the flood. Earl Dundas made a decision that saved lives that day. When his group reached the elevator shaft at the 1,500-foot level, he saw a handful of men still running toward them through the rising waters. Instead of leaving them behind, he turned back. In water that was rising by the foot, in tunnels that were literally melting around them. He guided those final workers to safety. The last group barely made it. By the time Earl slammed the metal gate shut behind him and the elevator began its final ascent, the water had almost reached them. The 1,500-foot level, those massive chambers that had taken generations to carve, disappeared completely, swallowed by Lake Peigneur. When the final group of miners stepped onto solid ground, gasping and soaked, the hoist operator cut power to the mine. There was nothing left to save below. All 55 men had escaped, but the mine they'd worked in for decades was gone forever. Above ground, the disaster was reaching proportions that seemed to violate the laws of physics themselves. Lake Peigneur was no longer a lake. It had become a swirling vortex of destruction, pulling in everything within reach. What had started as a small whirlpool above the sunken Texaco drilling rig had grown into something monstrous. The shoreline itself was giving way, entire sections of Jefferson Island crumbling and disappearing into that growing sinkhole. I watched trees that had stood for centuries tip over, their roots exposed for just seconds before vanishing into the swirling water. A tugboat with its engines at full throttle fought desperately against the pull, but even industrial-strength propulsion was no match for the force that was draining the lake. The crew abandoned ship just before it was dragged back into the vortex and disappeared forever. In total, 65 acres of land vanished into that whirlpool. Solid ground that had existed since Louisiana rose from the primordial swamp simply ceased to exist, pulled into depths that grew deeper by the minute. But the most spectacular and terrifying sight was yet to come. As the mine continued collapsing beneath the lake, trapped air from those massive underground chambers was forced upward. It started as low hissing sounds from the mine's air shafts, then became something more violent. Suddenly, a geyser erupted, shooting a column of water and debris 400 feet into the air, higher than a 30-story building. The force of that explosion rattled windows miles away. I felt it in my bones, a rumble that seemed to come from the center of the earth itself. Witnesses could do nothing but stand there, watching as everything they'd known about that peaceful little lake was obliterated by forces beyond human comprehension. But even after Lake Peigneur had virtually disappeared, the disaster was far from over. What happened next seemed to defy every law of nature. For as long as anyone could remember, the canal that connected Lake Peigneur to Vermilion Bay flowed in one direction, southward toward the Gulf of Mexico. It was a quiet waterway, used mostly by fishermen and small boats traveling between the lake and the bay. A gentle, predictable current that had flowed the same way for centuries. After the sinkhole swallowed the lake, something impossible happened. The current stopped. Then, without any warning, it began flowing backward. The canal reversed course completely. Instead of carrying water out to the Gulf, it began rushing in the opposite direction, funneling millions of gallons of salt water from the Gulf of Mexico straight into the crater that had been Lake Peigneur. The sudden reversal created something I still struggle to describe. A raging waterfall 50 feet high, formed in the middle of what used to be a shallow freshwater lake. For 2 days, that waterfall continued. Billions upon billions of gallons of seawater poured into the space where Lake Peigneur had been, creating something entirely new. The lake refilled, but it was transformed. Instead of 10 feet deep, it was now 200 feet deep, the deepest lake in Louisiana. Instead of fresh water that had supported bass and perch, it was now salt water, permanently altering the entire ecosystem. Fish populations died off overnight. Plant life that had thrived for generations couldn't survive in the new saline environment. The lake that refilled bore no resemblance to the one that had existed before November 20th, 1980. It was deeper, stranger, carrying within it the dissolved remains of that vast salt mine and all the secrets that had been buried there for millions of years. When the water finally stabilized, an eerie calm settled over the area. The whirlpool disappeared, the land stopped collapsing, the geyser went silent. But the lake that emerged from this catastrophe was alien to those of us who had known the original. It looked similar from a distance, but everything about it was wrong. The color of the water, the way light reflected off its surface, even the sounds it made when wind moved across it. Standing on the shore of this new Lake Peigneur was like looking at a completely different world that had somehow replaced the one we'd known our entire lives. In the aftermath, investigators tried to piece together what had gone wrong. But here's the thing that still bothers me. Despite the enormous scale of destruction, no one could say with absolute certainty how it happened. The Texaco drilling rig was gone, swallowed by depths that shouldn't have existed. The mine was collapsed and buried beneath millions of gallons of water. The bore hole that had punctured the mine had widened into an enormous crater, erasing any trace of its original position. Two theories emerged. Either Texaco's crew had miscalculated their coordinates and drilled directly into the salt mine, or Diamond Crystal's mine maps were outdated and inaccurate, meaning the underground chambers extended farther than anyone realized. Without physical evidence, investigators couldn't determine which theory was correct. The financial consequences were massive. Texaco and Wilson Brothers paid $32 million to Diamond Crystal Salt Company for destroying the mine. They also paid $12.8 million to Live Oak Gardens, the botanical garden that lost significant land when Jefferson Island collapsed. But money couldn't restore what had been lost. The Jefferson Island salt mine never reopened. Diamond Crystal tried to continue operations for a few years, but with the entire underground structure compromised, they finally shut down permanently in December 1986. Yet the most remarkable fact of all remains this: not a single human life was lost. 55 miners trapped beneath a collapsing lake escaped against impossible odds. Their survival was the result of quick thinking, proper emergency procedures, and the leadership of men like Junius Gaddison and Earl Dundas, who recognized danger and acted without hesitation. More than 4 decades later, I still think about that day. The whirlpool that swallowed barges like toys, the land that simply vanished, the impossible reversal of a river, the 400-foot geyser blasting debris into the sky. It seems more like science fiction than reality, but I lived through it. I watched an entire ecosystem disappear and be reborn as something completely different. Lake Peigneur today carries with it a story unlike any other. It's deeper, stranger, forever changed by forces that science still struggles to fully explain. The lake that exists now is not the one I grew up fishing in. It's something else entirely, a body of water born from catastrophe, holding within its depths the dissolved remains of decades of human industry and millions of years of geological history. Sometimes I wonder what other secrets lie buried beneath its surface, what other forces might be waiting down there in those impossible depths. Because if I learned anything from November 20th, 1980, it's that the world we think we know can vanish in minutes, replaced by something we never imagined possible. What do you think really caused the Lake Peigneur disaster? Was it human error, outdated maps, or something else entirely? Share your theories in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible event. And if you want to hear more stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about our world, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Trust me, there are more mysteries out there that will leave you questioning the very ground beneath your feet.